Renewables have a place in our energy mix, but the fact remains that they are intermittent and unreliable. They are not the silver bullet for Alberta's electricity needs, and they are not the silver bullet of electricity affordability. Albertans have been vocal that they don't want large-scale developments to interfere with our province's most beautiful natural features.
Premier Smith has chosen to announce this a day before her budget in the hopes that you won't notice, that you'll forget that Daniel Smith is killing an industry and making your life more expensive.
The government of Alberta today announced that it will restrict renewables built on farmland and create buffers for so-called pristine viewscapes. The policy announcement follows a pause on the development of all renewals as of last August. The minister overseeing the policy admits it will likely lead to less investment, but argues that's the cost of responsible land use. What message does the announcement send politically? Let's bring back the front bench to talk about that. Saeed Selvam, Gary Marr, Carl Belanger, and Marika Walsh. I should qualify, Gary, that I wrote that prior to my interview with him, and he didn't concede the same thing in our interview that he did in others that I had read him talk about. He was saying, I think renewable investment will still continue despite these restrictions. Do you think this is politically motivated, or do you think otherwise?
Well, first of all, I'll say this. Here in the province of Alberta, we are the leader in terms of per capita renewable generation of electricity. And the reason why is because we don't have a provincial crown corporation responsible for it. It's a market that's open to competition. The consequence is we have more wind and solar than any other place in the country on a per capita basis. But to the Premier's point, it is intermittent. So we've got roughly, say, 1,100 megawatts of electricity that can be generated in Alberta through solar panels. The problem with that is that the actual capacity of 1,100 megawatts is that we only get about 20% of actual electricity out of it because the wind doesn't, or the sun doesn't always shine on all days of the year. And same thing with wind turbines. We've got wind turbines in this province that generate or have the capacity to generate a lot of power, but the wind doesn't always blow. And I think what the Premier is trying to do politically is strike the balance between the need for renewables, which is a positive thing, to continue to have the expression of a provincial jurisdiction, which this is, and that there are two agencies that the province mandates to take care of it. One is the Surface Rights Board, and the second one is the Alberta Energy Regulator. Trying to strike the balance between, the needs of landowners, farmers, of maintaining pristine vistas in the province. I mean, I don't think anybody in the Gatineau Hills would want, the Gatineau Hills to be spoiled by a whole bunch of wind turbines that are placed there. I don't think that farmers in southwestern Saskatchewan would want productive farmland covered with solar panels. Right. And so trying to strike the balance, I think, is important here. But I would point out to, the Honourable Shahal, who spoke to the issue in Parliament today, that this is a provincial jurisdiction. And I don't think that there needs to be federal interference with what it is that the province of Alberta is trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I take that point, Saeed. I think that the reason, there is some, accusation from the government's critics about this being more political than anything else is because despite the concerns around land use and pristine land, and I was pointing this out to the minister earlier, there's this open pit coal mine that the regulators have said shouldn't go ahead in the Rocky Mountains, and the government has sort of intervened to put that before a regulatory process again, which sort of, prompts, I think, the question about whether this is ideological. Now, the minister, to be fair, said it isn't, but I think that's why the questions are being asked.
Yeah, and I think politically, this also makes sense for the Premier, just given the fact that she's kind of touted this line before. She is really focused on the fact that while Alberta is technically a leader when it comes to renewables, they need to kind of dial it back a little bit in order to make room for other projects. And she has consulted with different communities as well, where a lot of the feedback, especially from landowners, was that they want a lot of that land freed up. They don't want a lot of building or construction to happen on that land, especially. So she's in a good position politically to make this stance. But it also plays into the fact and the kind of narrative that she's had going back and forth between Ottawa, saying, look, this is my province. I'm very concerned about my province in terms of overreach or overregulation, but this is where I'm laying down the hammer. And I think that she has a lot of bandwidth to do that, just given the fact that this is not going to be a political lightning rod, like I think her saying, I'm not going to sign on to the pharmacare deal would be. So I think she's playing it safe, and she has the bandwidth to do it, especially given the fact that they've invested so much in renewables. And again, as we can recall, not too long ago, Alberta's grid was overloaded. So just timing-wise, this is a prudent way of saying, look, I'd like to make some room for some alternatives here.
It was overloaded. I mean, interestingly, not just was there not enough renewable energy to supplement it or supplant it, but also 2 natural gas plants failed in the midst of that big alert that went out in January. So it is definitely complicated. I think Saeed has a great point, though, about this not being the lightning rod with the federal government that other Alberta, Ottawa issues are, because no disrespect meant to Mr. Chahal, but in previous issues, you've seen a minister like Randy Boissonnault come out and really start sounding off on the premier. In this instance, it was not Randy Boissonnault or Stephen Guilbeault. It was George Chahal.
Yeah, I mean, I think that no disrespect to George Chahal, I think you're right. The level of prominence that comes with that is less. The fight is therefore a bit less. I think, though, the province has not really explained why there are inconsistencies between things like the open pit coal mine that you talked about to the minister, and the need to save the landscape from windmills. I mean, I think social media was sort of alight with many academics pointing out that there are wells on farmland in Alberta, and it's fine, and it happens. So I think this does seem to me to be more about a culture and political play rather than about an explanation of policy that is in line with their other policies that they have on other resource extraction. And I think it's interesting what the response from the business community will be, because it seems to be that there's one set of rules for traditional resources like fossil fuels and a different set of rules for renewables now for Alberta.
I'm really curious to see what the renewable industry says as well, because when the pause happened, of course, that took them all by shock, Carl. But they had been looking for certainty, and the minister's, framing on this is this policy will offer that certainty.
Yeah, I can't wait for the court to rule on what is a pristine view. Oh, well, this project cannot go ahead because it's a pristine view.
I live there. There's a lot of pristine views in Alberta.
But this view here is just, it's kind of nice. It's not pristine. So, I mean, it's fascinating to watch how a conservative government goes after an industry, goes after the market. And the market developed in Alberta in a way that you are a leader in this renewable energy field, and now you're giving that up. You're giving that up for what seems to be a little short-sighted. Now, I'm all in favor of defending pristine views, whatever that may be, but the reality is that, we can say that sun is intermittent, you can say that the wind is intermittent, but there's also a limited amount of fossil fuels available. The reserves in terms of oil in Alberta are about 50 years' worth at the rate of consumption right now. So what do you do next? And this is where I think it's a little short-sighted. Now, I think there will be a lot of challenges ahead. I think the industry doesn't think it gives them more certainty because it's not clear what's going to happen to their projects, and they're going to have to go through this new process and try to figure out if the view is pristine enough to block it.
Do you think, Gary, that there is a way for that investment to continue, or do you think de facto, because there will just be more restrictions on where it can develop, that it will mean less investment?
I think with the right policy levers, investment can continue. But again, it's about striking the balance between landowners, tourism, ecological values, the need for electricity. But, here's what I'll say, Carl and everybody else in the panel, I invite you to come out to Western Canada and see how beautiful this part of the world is. And so you would appreciate why Albertans feel very strongly about the eastern slopes and the whaleback regions of the province and the Rocky Mountains. If you haven't been here, I'll say, a picture's worth 1,000 words,
there
but
many times, Gary. Been there
a
many
visit is
times.
worth 1,000
Europe's
pictures.
covered in
A visit
windmills.
is worth 1,000 pictures.
It is, and it is pristine. I having lived there and covered you, Gary, at the time, I can't disagree with that. I think, though, the argument around the pristine nature of the land site, I'll circle back to it, you'd think would also apply to an open pit coal mine as equally as it does to a huge windmill.
You'd think so, and I guess that's why they're dodging that whole issue. I mean, they're not doubling down on it. They're not really talking about it or highlighting it. They're essentially saying, hey, we are basically at capacity when it comes to renewable energy. We want to defend our pristine lands. We want to make sure that Calgary and the rest of Alberta remains as pristine as possible, focusing on things like tourism. But again, the main industry is agriculture. Agriculture is so important to the province of Alberta. So it's the focus on that, I think, is where they're trying to shift by talking about lands that are well developed for irrigation. And I think that's essentially where they're going to be focusing a lot of their attention going forward. But again, this is Module A of the regulation and the
Yes.
announcement that's come out. So curious to see what the next module is going to look like.
Yeah, phase 2 will reconvene at that point and discuss it. I appreciate all of you making the time for a great discussion. Our front bench, Saeed Selvam, Gary Marr, Carl Belanger, and Mariko Walsh.